Chapter 25. A Home in Ruins. The soldiers began to emerge from the cover of the trees. By their uniforms, Reyes was able to deduce that they had been members of the Lamington militia. The Lamington militia had been armed in one of two ways. Those that had guarded the gateways and certain buildings inside the city were armed with spears, whereas those that had paced the battlements and the streets had tended to be armed with longbows. Both types of soldier were represented in the patrol that now stood before them. Reyes daren't make any sudden move, as those soldiers that were armed with bows started to take up offensive positions around him and Gaggara. He could see some of the other soldiers heading towards the back of the column, but he dare not turn his head to watch. What Reyes found most worrying was that each of the bowmen had prepared an arrow, and had even drew back the string so that the bow was ready to fire. It would only take a small accident for one of those soldiers to fire his bow. Maybe it wouldn't even be an accident. Who would care that much about a couple of dead harpies left out in the forest? "Do as I do," Reyes whispered to Gaggara, and then, moving very slowly so as not to unduly alarm any of the soldiers, he placed his hands on top of his head. Gaggara gave him a questioning look, and then copied him. "I'm scared." "Me too," Reyes agreed. There was one young lad in particular. He looked far too young for the responsibility that had been given him. Reyes could tell that the boy was shaking, scared of the two harpies. Like the others, the boy had his bowstring drawn, ready to fire. Reyes couldn't help but feel extremely nervous. It worried him even more that this boy seemed to be aiming at Gaggara. Reyes began to realise that the idea of his own death didn't bother him as much as the threat of losing his girlfriend and his child did. "I'm beginning to wish I'd stayed with Reyes," Gaggara commented. "We should have stayed with Reyes." "Keep quiet," the officer of the patrol shouted. Now that his men had the threat of the two harpies under control, he stepped out into the clearing, as did the other soldiers. This officer also wore the livery of the Lamington militia, the rank insignia marking him out to be a captain. "If you must speak, speak in flourish. I want to know everything the two of you say to each other." "Gaggara doesn't speak flourish," Reyes explained defensively. "Really?" the captain commented in a tone that suggested he didn't believe a word. Then he pointed to two of his men in quick succession. "You and you. I want you two to carry the harpies back to camp." "Carry us?" Reyes asked. He looked at the men the captain had selected. They were both very large men with quite muscular frames. Reyes was sure they would have no trouble carrying Gaggara and himself. "Yes, carry you," the captain said. "I have standing orders to kill your ilk on the spot. We weren't expecting to take back prisoners with us, and didn't bring anything to secure you with. Nor can I afford the chance that either of you try to fly away, especially not once you know the location of our encampment. The best I can do is surround you with archers in case you try to escape, and have you carried, to prevent you from flying. I believe you'll find it awkward to fly if you're being carried." "I guess so," Reyes agreed somewhat reluctantly. "I'll need to tell Gaggara so she knows what to expect." "Very well," the officer agreed. "Know, though, that I shall be watching you." Reyes nervously turned towards his girlfriend and told her what the captain planned. He added that under no circumstances should she react in any way that might be considered hostile. "I hope they're gentle," Gaggara said worriedly. "Are they aware I'm pregnant?" The two soldiers that had been chosen for the task of carrying the harpies put their bows away and began to approach Reyes and Gaggara. Reyes recognised the expressions on their faces. He had seen many an elf in Goldspawn sent to his execution wearing a similar expression. They moved like condemned men trying to creep up on a hungry lion, whilst wearing a necklace of deer meat. "I'll take the female," one of them said, his voice gruff and nervous. You take the other one." "Why do you get the female?" the other protested. "'Cause I spoke first," was the gruff reply. Reyes wondered why anyone would rather carry a female harpy. After all, Gaggara had been trained to hunt and kill since she was 2. She was a huntress in every way and quite capable of killing whoever carried her with her bare claws. Of the two of them, he was by far the less dangerous. At least one he didn't have a sword in his hand. As the soldiers reached the two harpies, Reyes found himself being roughly manhandled. He was thrown bodily over the left shoulder of the militiaman like he was no more than a sack of potatoes. The soldier didn't seem to care about any discomfort or pain that Reyes might suffer as a result. As he lay there, on the shoulder, he could feel every movement the soldier made. The soldier's armour dug hard into his stomach. Reyes was sure this was not going to be a pleasant journey. He worried about Gaggara being treated the same way. If she was thrown around like this, it could cause some serious damage to her baby. He tried to look in her direction. It wasn't that easy to do, as the way he had been picked up offered him very little scope in the way of movement. By the look of it, the soldier had been a lot gentler picking Gaggara up. By comparison, he was treating her like a delicate flower. She was sitting on his back with her legs around his midriff and her arms around his neck. If she wanted, she could drop to the ground and be in the air within a couple of seconds. If she wanted to, she could snap the neck of the man carrying her in less than a second. Reyes could no longer see the militia captain, but he heard the order, "Okay, let's go." Reyes assumed that he and Gaggara were being carried somewhere towards the front of the patrol. Due to the way he was being carried, he couldn't see anything of what lay before him, but if he lifted his head at the right angle, he could see the vast crowd of the people of Fastbrook bringing up the rear, their shepherds scattered on either side of them. Reyes was also painfully aware that between him and those villagers was a line of 4 archers. Each had an arrow at the ready, although at least they no longer had their bowstrings drawn and were holding their weapons at a more neutral angle. They couldn't have been on the road for much more than half an hour when suddenly there was an amazed exclamation from Gaggara. "Wow!" "What is it?" Reyes asked her worriedly. "I just saw the Drake man disappear," Gaggara told him. "He just vanished into thin air." "Drake man? Oh, you mean the—" Then Reyes realised he didn't know the Harpy word for captain either. "Keep quiet, you two," the soldier carrying Reyes said. The soldier slapped Reyes on the back of the thigh with his heavy gauntleted hand. Reyes wished he could see where he was going. He wished the soldier's armour didn't jostle him with every step, or that he wasn't beginning to feel a little bit on the queasy side. The soldiers didn't seem to be alarmed by the phenomena of their officer suddenly vanishing like that. They didn't even begin to slow down. Whatever had happened had evidently been expected. Some of the villagers began to panic, mainly children. Some of them even tried to flee back along the path from whence they had come. The soldiers stemmed the panic as best they could. Some seemed to know what they were doing and did their very best to assure the villagers that nothing was wrong. Others, though, didn't seem to know how to handle a situation such as this and began to push the villagers along the path. Then Reyes felt a slight tingling on his skin. To him, it was obvious that there was a magical barrier of some kind across the path. Once he had been carried across the magical barrier, Reyes found himself in a large clearing in the middle of the forest, completely surrounded by soldiers. It was hard for Reyes not to be scared when every pair of eyes seemed to suddenly focus on him. There were soldiers everywhere, hundreds of soldiers. If things turned sour now, the chances for Reyes and Gaggara to get away were probably non-existent. "Are you sure we're safe?" Gaggara said worriedly. Reyes didn't answer. He was still hopeful that this would pan out for the two of them, but suddenly he was extremely aware what it felt like to be a harpy in the hands of those who wanted you dead. Reyes tried to lift his head enough to see where they had just come from. There were 2 large pillars. They looked like they were made from marble, and they were covered in all manner of mystical symbols. The 2 pillars glowed with a magical blue light. Reyes was in no doubt that they had been the source of the magical barrier. What was more, he was certain that from the other side they were either invisible or at least melded into the rest of the forest. After all, Gaggara would have mentioned it if she had seen a couple of marble pillars sticking out like sore thumbs in the middle of the forest. The further he was carried from the pillars, the more soldiers he could see. The humans were taking no chances. There had to be close to 1,000 soldiers gathered around the magical pillars. In many cases they sat at small campfires, trying to keep out the cold of the early morning. There were soldiers from Castle Damothe, soldiers from Lamington, and perhaps most surprisingly, soldiers from Ganespa. "Okay, put them down," Reyes heard the captain say. Reyes found himself suddenly thrown unceremoniously to the ground. He landed awkwardly on his front. The only thing he could think of was at least he hadn't landed on one of his wings. He moved carefully to a more comfortable seated position and glanced round to see how Gaggara was being treated. The soldier carrying Gaggara treated her with a lot more tenderness and consideration. He bent his knees so that she could drop easily off his back. She stood there for a moment, clearly unsure of what was happening, and then she sat down on the mildew-damp grass next to Reyes. The captain looked at the 2 harpies and said, "Okay, Reyes, I'm going to go and establish your credentials. Assuming you are who you claim to be, you have nothing to worry about." "Thank you, Captain," Reyes replied. The captain nodded. Then he turned to the archers that were under his command. You know what to do if they threaten anyone or try to escape. I'll be back shortly." With that, the captain left them with the archers and made his way across to a small tent that had been erected no more than 30 feet from where Reyes and Gaggara were now sitting. Now that Reyes was no longer being carried, he could finally see the entire encampment. It was huge. Admittedly, it was a wild estimate, but Reyes assumed it had to be at least 100 acres, probably much bigger. How big would the place have to be to house the entire population of the Damothe? And by the look of it, a fair portion of Ganespa. The people had been very busy. There were tents everywhere and some huts had been built while others were in the middle of being constructed. Although it was still very early in the morning, a lot of people were already up and about working to make their home away from home livable. There weren't only people, but there was a lot of livestock, all sitting in small corrals built for the purpose. Reyes couldn't help but feel that the people of each village were keeping pretty much to themselves and were mingling as little as possible. The thing that caught Reyes' eye the most, though, was the large ruined edifice that seemed to be sitting almost exactly in the middle of the encampment. It was the ruins of the old castle. It was smaller than the castle Reyes had grown up in. The old castle had been built to overlook and protect the city of Lamington shortly after the Damothe first fell into human hands. By the look of it, the old castle had been a far more utilitarian building. With Lamington so close, the noble house of the Damothe had probably quartered in the city except during times of abject emergency. The castle had clearly been built for defence rather than comfort. The years had grown heavy on what was left of the castle. Large chunks were missing from many of its remaining walls. It had never been damaged in battle, but it had definitely lost a piece when the Damothe family had deserted it for the new one. The locals had moved in almost immediately and started to strip the castle of its stone for their own needs. It was probably amazing that so much of the castle was still left standing. For the most part, the villagers of Fastbrook walked past the two harpies without a second glance. They were more intent on finding somewhere in the encampment where they could settle down and call their own. A few did bother to actually acknowledge Reyes and Gaggara and wave to them, but only a few. It wasn't a long wait. The captain of the patrol returned after only being gone for a couple of minutes. He wasn't alone. The people of Florif had some very traditional views as to the role of women in society. It was the job of women to keep house for the man, to cook, to clean, and to look after the children. Women did not fight, but did not dress in armour, and they most certainly did not ride into battle. The person accompanying the captain was not just a woman. She was dressed in heavy plate armour of the same type as worn by the knights of the realm. Nor was it just something that she had managed to pick up. The armour had clearly been made specially for her, as was obvious from the breastplate. She was reasonably tall, and despite that bulky armour, very lithe. The armour she wore was of the purest steel plate, darkened to avoid unwanted reflection by the sun. It was inlaid with fancy gold-coloured motifs across her waist, breasts, and at her sleeves and ankles. At her waist she carried a longsword. With another fancy motif on the very end of the blade's handle. Reyes had only ever seen one woman wearing armour before. The suit was different, and Anida had grown older in the years since he had last seen her. She had gotten bigger in more ways than one, but she still walked in much the same way she always had. There was a slight swing in her step, and perhaps a little too much curve at her hips. She stopped right in front of Reyes, placed her hand on the hilt of her sword and said, "Harpies? Why did you bring me to see harpies? You know we have standing orders concerning harpies. Kill them." The archers began to prepare their bows for firing. "Anida?" Reyes said, a little unsure. He glanced nervously at the surrounding archers. "What?" the woman said. She looked round sharply. "How do you know my name?" "It's me," Reyes said quickly. "Reyes. Reyes Damothe." "Reyes?" the woman said. "My gods, Reyes. It's good to see you." She looked about herself quickly, saying, "Forget my last order. These two are our guests." Then, to make sure the archers understood what was expected of them, she ordered, "For heaven's sake, put those things away. You might hurt someone." "Hello, Anida," Reyes said happily. Suddenly he felt a great relief of pressure. He became dimly aware of a headache and wasn't sure if it was caused by the lack of sleep or anxiety of nearly being killed. He climbed nervously to his feet. "It's very good to see you again." Anida removed the helm of her armour and revealed the friendly face that lurked within. After a year in Goldspawn, it was a most welcome sight. "You too, Reyes. She let her helm drop to the ground and held out her arms to him. Reyes accepted the invitation and moved in for a hug. It's been too long. What's going on? Gaggara said angrily. I don't mind sharing you with another harpy, but I'll draw the line at humans. It's okay, Reyes said, letting go of Anida. We're old friends. We haven't seen each other for a long time. I see, Gaggara said uncertainly. Anida walked over to Gaggara. This must be your girlfriend Gaggara. I've heard a lot about her. I was glad to hear that you seemed to be settling in and that you'd gotten yourself a girlfriend. Anida offered Gaggara her hand. Gaggara tilted her head a little to the side and looked at the hand suspiciously. And then, evidently deciding that the offer of aid was genuine, she grasped it. Anida helped to pull Gaggara to her feet. I am called Anida. Anida, Gaggara repeated. She glanced toward Reyes. Reyes nodded. I guess if you're a friend of Reyes, Gaggara said, then I'm pleased to meet you. Anida looked at Gaggara blankly. Sorry, I didn't catch that. She looked at Reyes. I really don't speak the language. I just know a few words I picked up from Jenny. She says she's pleased to meet you, Reyes explained. Oh, good, Anida commented. Likewise. She retrieved her hand from Gaggara and walked over to the man who had captained the patrol. I hope this idiot didn't treat you too badly. Perhaps we can find a more suitable use for his talents. The captain seemed to shrink into himself. He started to look for something to fix his gaze on. Don't be too harsh on him, Reyes said. I can't blame him for being careful. Besides, he did come and find you to check on my claim before doing anything too drastic. I guess you're right, Anida commented, glaring at the patrol captain. Come on, let's take a walk. We can chat about old times. Well, actually I could use a little sleep, Reyes admitted. Then we must find you both a place to bed down for a few hours, Anida agreed. I assume you'd like to stay together. And food, Reyes added. We're both very hungry. Of course, Anida accepted. That metabolism of yours really burns up the energy. It must be all that flying you do. Gaggara, Reyes said as he took his girlfriend by the hand. Anida is going to find us a place to rest and get us some food, okay? That sounds good, Gaggara agreed eagerly. She took Reyes' hand happily and began to beat her wings as if she was preparing to take off. Reyes put his hand on one of Gaggara's wings. We should stick to the ground for now. We don't want to spook the locals. Oh, Gaggara seemed a little less happy. If you say so, handsome. Anida began to lead the way. She headed deep into the clearing, making a beeline for the old ruined castle. As she walked, she talked to Reyes, speaking as one who had a whole year's worth of news that she wanted to get off her chest before they reached their destination. I have to admit, I'm glad to see you again. I always had a thing about you. I suppose you could call it a crush. Although I never really thought of you in romantic terms. It was more a case that there was something special about you. You know what I mean? You always seemed to have something that none of the other boys at the castle had. I never dreamt it could be a pair of wings. I'm glad to see you got yourself a girl. You deserve a bit of happiness after what happened to you on the day of your sister's engagement party. How is my sister, by the way? Reyes asked. We haven't heard a thing, Anida said. She turned and looked at Reyes, showing concern on her face. You know, I should have been there yesterday at the capital watching her get married. Instead, we got your message and had to set about evacuating the dukedom. The wedding must have been called off anyway, of course. Of course, Reyes agreed. I can't decide if I want to see her at the head of the great ducal army, or if I prefer that she stay in First Town where it's safe, Anida commented. I know what you mean, Reyes replied. Then he indicated the ruins of the castle standing before them. Is this really a good place for my brother to hide the people of this dukedom? I can't help but think that this castle is an obvious location, and the elves are bound to come and check it out. We're protected by magic. Manglos is a very powerful mage. The elves will never find this place unless they come through one of the 3 sets of magical pillars. And if they do? Reyes asked. You saw how many troops we had stationed around the one you came in. No more than 4 abreast can fit through the pillars at any one time. They would get slaughtered, Anida replied. Anida continued to lead the 2 harpies through the camp. Some of those who were awake and had already started on their chores of the day seemed to see the 2 harpies and couldn't take their eyes off them. Several of these peasants even reached for nearby household or garden implements, something that could be used as a weapon should the situation require it. They stayed on their guard, even when Anida and the 2 harpies had walked well beyond them. It was getting late in the year, and many of the families had lit fires during the night to keep out the cold. As the night turned to early morning, many of those fires were now being used to cook with. The smells coming off of some of those fires were unbelievably lovely, especially to the nose of a harpy who hadn't eaten since last night. Gaggara broke away from the other two and began to walk casually over to one of the fires where part of a pig was slowly being roasted. Gaggara, Reyes warned. The last thing he felt they could afford right now was to get a reputation for stealing food. Don't. Gaggara looked round at him, a hurt expression on her face. But I'm hungry. That food isn't ours to take, Reyes told her. Gaggara walked back to her boyfriend, a puzzled expression on her face. I don't understand. I thought that was a fire pit. It is, Reyes said. But in the same way most harpy villages have their own fire pits, here they are intended for the one family. Each family has their own cooking fire. You've lived in Goldspawn, it's the same way the elves live. Gaggara looked unsure. I didn't get invited into too many elven homes. My only knowledge is a small part of Harpy Town and the compound of the Hope. In both cases the fire pits were always communal. Yes, Reyes agreed, but only for those that lived in that part of Harpy Town, or who served with the Hope. What would have happened if you tried to feast from a fire pit in one of the villages in Harpy Town? They would have killed me, Gaggara replied. If they could. Same sort of thing, Reyes said. Just imagine that these food pits belong to a different village. It's not ours to take. We have to find our own food. You want I should go hunting? Gaggara asked. Not right now. I'm sure Anida will find something for us, Reyes explained. Are you two okay? Anida asked. I hate to see you two fall out. It's nothing, Reyes replied. Must be the way the language sounds. We were just chatting. It's just that Gaggara is very hungry, and so am I, come to that. And there is all this food being cooked all around us. Do you think... You want me to get you some food? Anida asked. Well, I suppose it doesn't hurt to ask. She approached the family and the cooking meat. Anida would try and talk them into giving us something, Reyes told Gaggara. He put his arm around Gaggara's shoulder, both to show her his affection for her, and to assure that she didn't try to follow Anida towards the food. From where they stood, he could easily hear everything that was being said. Hi, Anida said. Look, I have a couple of very hungry... No, the father of the family said firmly. This food is for my family. Even if I was inclined to share it, I wouldn't do so with a pair of monsters. What if I was to pay? Anida suggested. What use is money at the moment? The man replied. Look at this place. What is there to buy? Money won't fill my family's bellies. Anida sighed and nodded. Having apparently been given the rank of Honourable Knight, Reyes knew that Anida would have been well within her rights to requisition the food for the war effort had she been of a mind. Reyes was glad she didn't. The family probably did need that food, and besides it would have felt like stealing. Sorry, Anida said, returning to the two harpies. I'm sure I can find you something once I've got you settled in. I'll get by with it a little later. Thank you, Reyes replied. Just don't go hunting, please, Anida pleaded. I know the harpy definition of hunting includes the livestock on farms as fair game. That wouldn't be a good idea, Reyes agreed. I'm sure most of the livestock here would be in great need. We'll hold off on the hunt. Just remember to bring us something. I'm not sure how long I can hold Gaggara when she's hungry. Thank you, Reyes. Let's move on, Anida said. Where are we going anyway? Reyes asked. To the castle, Anida replied. Nearly all the nobles have taken rooms in the castle, so it's reasonable that you should stay there too. Your brother's taken a room somewhere near the top of the old residency. Personally, I'm not sure it's all that stable up there, but he insists on being high up. My father and I have also taken rooms there, as have Manglos, Sir Richmond, Duke Ganespa, and his family. Yes, Reyes commented. I saw all the Ganespan troops. Anida nodded. It's a new duke. I guess he's your cousin or your uncle or whatever. What happened to my grandfather? Reyes asked. He stepped down for his son and left for the wedding at the capital, Anida explained. As they got even closer to the castle, two children, a young boy and a young girl, ran out in front of them. Gaggara had a bemused expression on her face. She tilted her head just slightly and gave the children the friendliest smile as she could muster. Clearly she was doing her best to be accepted. The two children turned and looked wide-eyed at the harpies, and then began to flee. Kel, Menitilda, Anida called after them. Come and greet your Uncle Reyes. The two children ignored her and continued to flee. That was Cal and Minnie Tilda, Ray said, surprised. They've grown a lot since I last saw them. No doubt, Anida agreed. Not as much as some, though. Hard to believe that you and Tilda are about the same age. Quite so, Race agreed. I used to wonder how that could be. Now I guess I know. He flapped his wings to emphasise the point. Anida led them to the front of what remained of the castle. The structure looked as if a good sneeze might bring the whole thing down at any moment. So, here we are. Find yourself a room and make yourselves comfortable. I'd better be getting back to my post. Thank you, Race said. He looked lovingly at Gaggara. I'm sure we'll both be very comfortable.